Can using a Ouija board, a spirit board, even using it as a game, open up a portal to the other side? And if it can you ever really be sure that what you're letting in is the spirit you wanted to talk to, or even the one it claims to be? Can dark spirits trick you? Can they enter this world, this realm, through the use of a spirit board? And if so, can you ever make them leave? Welcome to Fangs and Folklore. I'm your host, Matthew R. Miller. Boy, we have a good one tonight. If you are familiar with the Spanish horror film Veronica, or Veronica, from a few years ago, this is the real-life case on which it was based. The case centers around a girl named Estefanía Gutiérrez. And Estefania, which is of course Stephanie in English, lived with her family in Madrid, Spain. She lived in an apartment in a working-class neighborhood on Luis Marin Street, Calle de Luis Marin. She was one of seven children, so 6 siblings. She was raised by her parents. Her mother's name was Concepcion, and her father's name was Maximo. And the children, including her, went to a school nearby. She was in high school when all this started. They were all described as good students, and Estefania was described as being cheerful, friendly, caring, polite, had friends. And she often looked after her siblings, her 6 siblings. When you have a household and a family that large, sometimes the oldest child helps to look after the younger ones. And so she loved her siblings. They were all close. There were no family issues there, from what we know. Now, the grandfather also lived in the house, in the apartment with the family. And as you know, this is fairly common in many cultures to have multi-generational households. Unfortunately, the grandfather suffered from dementia. And if you know anything about the disease dementia, you know that it can change people's personalities. Sometimes totally different, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. And it can make them do and say things that maybe they never would have done or said had they not had the disease. Now, before he, got dementia, the family, the children described him as affectionate, a good grandfather, a good grandpa. But when he got dementia, he changed. He became hostile. He became verbally abusive and often said threatening or disturbing things. In early 1990, so not that long ago really, this grandfather was getting close to death. And the family was gathered around his bed, and he was essentially dying. But before he died, he leaned into Estefania and whispered to her that if he couldn't harm her in this life, he would do it in the next life. Those were his final words. Just think about that. Your grandfather, whom you've known and loved all your life, has this horrible disease, dementia, and now is threatening, saying that he wanted to hurt you in this life, but now that he's dying, he will hurt you in the next life. That's chilling. Even if it is the dementia speaking, which it was. Still, to see a loved one say something so horrible is traumatic. After he died, family life continued, The children went to school, the parents worked. And it was in 1990 also that Estefania was at school, and a friend of hers brought a Ouija board. If you know what the Ouija board is, it's a spirit board. It's basically a board, a flat, board, wooden, cardboard, depending, it can be any material. On the board is the entire English alphabet, the words yes and no, and the words goodbye, and the word goodbye. And so the idea is that it's a way to communicate with spirits, with ghosts, with the deceased. You can ask questions. It can answer yes or no if it's a yes or no question. Or if it's an information question, it can use the alphabet, allegedly, right, to spell out the replies. Although the board called the Ouija board itself is a game and was marketed as a game, as a parlor trick, I guess, made by a toy company, the concept of spirit boards is ancient, and many ancient civilizations had such things. If not a literal board with writing on it, some were, but also things like stones or things you could, choose yes or no and move around, ways to communicate with the spirits. So Estefania and her friends they had a friend, another friend, who had died recently in a motorcycle accident, sadly. And, a friend of theirs at their age, very sad. And so they got this Ouija board and they wanted to try to communicate with the spirit of that deceased friend. So they got together in the school, at a private room. They kind of like found an empty room and locked the door, closed the door. And they were going to do it there. And it was somewhere near the library, we know. Estefania's sister, one of her sisters, Marianela, stood outside the room as a lookout. In case if a teacher comes, say, "Hey, a teacher's coming, pack it up," right? And the Ouija board, as you know, that at least the Milton, I forget which company makes the toy, but it has a planchette, which is like a triangle kind of device with a clear plastic in the middle, and it moves over the board, allegedly. And whatever letter it hovers over, you see it through the glass. So if it hovers over the M or the word yes, that's apparently what the spirit's trying to communicate. They had a glass instead of a planchette. For some reason, they had lost the planchette or didn't have it, and so they used an overturned glass. And they began asking questions. As they began asking questions, the glass began to move. And they at first thought it was the ghost or the spirit of their friend who had died in the motorcycle accident, but they quickly realized that this spirit was hostile, that it was claiming to be different people, and it was not acting very friendly. And at one point, it even claimed to be Estefania's grandfather, the one who had recently died. While the session was going on, Estefania's sister Marianela tried to open the door to look inside, and she couldn't. The door was stuck. Now, it was not locked, and it was not barred or, barricaded. It was as if a force were pushing back against the door, and she couldn't open it. She panicked, so she went and found a teacher and admitted, what was happening, but said, "Please come help us open the door." And the teacher's name was Dolores Molina. So these are real people in the recent past. And they were able to push and shove and force the door open. As soon as they did, the glass that the students, the friends, were using as a planchette, it fell and it shattered on the floor. So they were doing this on a table or something. It fell, it shattered on the floor. And they all said when it shattered, a kind of a strange smoke rose up from the glass as if it had been inside of it. And then Estefania breathed in the smoke unintentionally. So it entered into her. Then, as they were still in the room, the window blinds moved on their own. And there's a sudden drop in temperature. It felt cold. And then one of the participants, a boy, later said that he felt like something had hit him in the chest. And he had, in fact, the next day or two, a dark mark on his chest. And then Marianela, the sister, was standing on a staircase or something, and she felt cold wind, and then she felt like a force lifted her off the ground briefly. So, they packed up and got the hell out of there, as you might imagine. So the teacher and all the students and Estefania's sister witnessed these things. After this incident, Estefania's behavior changed. Who had always been an outgoing girl with friends and sweet and friendly, now she became withdrawn and distant. She began having terrible insomnia, and she experienced vivid, hyper-realistic nightmares involving shadowy figures calling out to her and telling her to follow them. These visions, these nightmares, would eventually start happening while she was awake as well. In fact, she said that she began seeing human-like figures with no faces, wearing long clothing like robes, as if they were some kind of strange faceless monks or nuns. And they would stand in the corners of the house or in the hallways and beckon to her and call her to join them. Now that alone is terrifying if you're seeing these things when you're already awake. It's scary enough to have a vivid nightmare. I have those all the time. But when it happens when you're awake, well, that's something paranormal. Around this same time, Estefania began experiencing kind of like these fits, these spells, these episodes where she would sit in a trance and they would last for about 15 to 20 minutes. She would just sit quietly and not look at anyone, not respond to anyone, but occasionally she would laugh a little bit during this spell. Afterwards, she said that what everyone else had witnessed as a kind of a daze, a trance, she said during that time, she had seen herself like walking down a hallway filled with smoke or fog, and she heard voices calling her name. She saw tall, thin figures gathered together saying, "Come on." Of course in Spanish, right? But meaning, "Come on, come join us." Estefania then began making strange guttural sounds sometimes, and then speaking in a language her family did not recognize. One night, she said that she looked on the wall near her bed and saw the Virgin Mary. Not a painting, not a statue, but as if the person, Mary herself, were there. This is creepy to me because it means that this entity, whatever's happening here, I don't think it meant well, and it's pretending to be Mary. If you know something about Spain, you know that it's a very Catholic country. Estefania and her family were all Catholics, faithful Catholics. Very Catholic place, right? And so whatever this thing was posing as the Virgin Mary, who is a very important figure in the Catholic Church. Estefania became aggressive. She began lashing out at her siblings, even going so far as to growl and to bark like a dog, and actually physically assaulted her siblings more than once. And of course, this is totally unlike her. It's almost as if the spirit of her grandfather's dementia were somehow affecting her. She did not have dementia. She never had it. She never got it. But think about how her grandfather's personality had changed because of the disease, and now her personality is changing kind of in a similar manner. Now, here is something to remember, okay? Her mother, Estefania's mother, Concepcion, she had epilepsy. Sometimes had epilepsy attacks. Estefania was never officially diagnosed with epilepsy, but she would sometimes have these epileptic-like periods. She would convulse, and it would kind of look like a seizure. And her body would become rigid, her eyes would roll back, and she would foam at the mouth. Even though she was never diagnosed with epilepsy, and even though her mother did have epilepsy, her mother had never experienced any of the hallucinations or hearing and seeing the things that Estefania did. And so her parents took her to many hospitals to see many doctors. She was evaluated by specialists, and no clear diagnosis was ever made. In fact, some doctors said she does show signs of epilepsy, but some other neurological symptoms and tests indicated that she did not have epilepsy. She was prescribed medications such as Tegretol, which is it's an anticonvulsant, and it's used to treat epilepsy and also bipolar disorder, interestingly enough. But the medicine had no effect on her whatsoever. The spells, the hallucinations, all of it continued. Some professionals suggested she might be having a psychotic breakdown, and then other people suggested that she may have been possessed. Which is interesting because all this began after the Ouija board session right after her grandfather had died and threatened her. Estefania's problems continued, and now other members of the family began experiencing some things that they couldn't explain. They entered into a period of what might be considered classic poltergeist phenomena. Objects would move around on their own in the house. Lights would be flickering on and off. Appliances like the iron or the television would turn on and off by themselves. They would hear doors slamming from other places in the house, and they would run there, but no one was there. There's no explanation for it. Her siblings, all of whom were younger, they felt things grabbing them, shaking them, pushing them, unseen things. And the younger ones were pulled by their arms and even thrown against walls. So this is violent activity. In fact, one of the children was so young it was sleeping in a crib, and one night the mother saw the crib being shaken violently. So whatever's happening here, whether it be a poltergeist or the spirit of her grandfather or something else that had entered through the Ouija board, experiment, it was clearly hostile, it was clearly violent, and it was physically assaulting the family. Not just causing these things around the house to happen like a poltergeist, but physically assaulting them. In fact, Marianela, who's the sister of Estefania, said that she once actually saw Estefania levitating slightly above her bed. You may know that levitation is a phenomenon almost strictly seen in demon possession cases. It's not seen in hauntings. It's seen almost exclusively in cases of demonic possession or alleged cases of demonic possession. Things got worse. The family began seeing shadowy figures walking around the apartment, hiding in corners. They heard loud knocking at all hours of the day and night. They had trouble sleeping because of all the sounds. The activity became stronger at night, as this activity sometimes tends to do. And certain rooms, especially the bathroom, were the most active. The bathroom was the most active room in the house. Now, this was an apartment, remember, in a building. And so there was nothing, it wasn't like an old, 200-year-old creepy Victorian mansion or something. It was an apartment just like all the others on that floor in the building. And the building was relatively new. I mean, it wasn't like, from the Middle Ages. It wasn't some kind of relic. It was just a modernish apartment building in a working-class neighborhood. I mentioned the bathroom. In one particular incident, Estefania went into the bathroom. She began screaming, terrified screaming, saying she saw a shadow in there with her. An iron, like a clothes iron, that was in the bathroom for some, at the time, for whatever reason, it turned itself on, but it didn't get hot. It remained cold. The door slammed shut and locked, and so Estefania was trapped in the bathroom with this haywire iron device and with a shadowy figure there. Her mother had managed to go with her, to go into the bathroom to check on her when she screamed, and she was in there with her too, so the door's locked. Now, the father, Maximo, he tried to break down the door. He ran at it a couple of times, but as he was running at it to try to hit it with his shoulder, the door just opened on its own. When that happened, Maximo, Concepcion, and Estefania, they experienced a sudden drop in temperature. The bathroom became freezing and heard whispers echoing around the room. They were not the only ones to experience this. Their friends and neighbors who came over at different times also had unusual experiences. One friend was struck by an object that had been thrown across the room. Unfortunately, I don't know what that object was. I couldn't find that, but something flew across the room and hit that friend without anyone being near the object. Others also, some of the friends and neighbors also reported seeing these shadowy figures wandering around the apartment. In another instance, a drinking glass, was thrown across a room, and instead of hitting the wall and breaking, it exploded mid-air in the middle of the, flying across the room. Now here's where this story becomes kind of sad. Estefania began saying that she thought she would die soon. She just said that she felt it. She believed that she would die soon. And, of course, the family, there was no reason. She didn't have any medical reason to be dying soon. She just felt it. And so the family was, of course, horrified and saddened. But she said, yes, I am going to die soon. And when I die, at my funeral, I'm going to tell you who should be there, who should not be there. And I want you to take this picture, this photo of me and Dad, of Maximo and Estefania, put it in the coffin with me. And she said, if her wishes were not followed, if her instructions were not followed at the funeral, she would return. Now, let me pause for a moment. What I'm seeing here is kind of a repeat of the grandfather's experiences with dementia. Again, Estefania did not have dementia, but she started acting weird, acting negatively, lashing out, and then she also made kind of this weird threat that that after death she would come back, just like the grandfather had said. So I see a parallel there. I see, similarities in those two things. So you have to ask, whatever had come through the Ouija board, could it really have been the spirit of her grandfather, or could it have been a dark spirit pretending, something like that? Now, believe it or not, Estefania had not stopped using the Ouija board. She had a friend named Demetrio. Sorry about my Spanish pronunciation. Let's call him Demetrio. And so during this Ouija board session, he fell on the floor. He started violently convulsing, shaking, kind of like the epileptic symptoms again. He also was not epileptic. He became aggressive. He started threatening Estefania and the family, lashing out, lunging out at them. And so the parents called the police. The policeman came and they restrained him and with like cuffs. And he kept gnashing and thrashing against the cuffs. And the police were scared because he was showing like almost superhuman strength. And in fact, one officer said, "Hey man, if you break out of those cuffs, I'm going to shoot you." After Demetrio was taken to the hospital and calmed down and returned, he said that during this Ouija board session, all he remembered was offering himself to the entity, saying that he would take the spirit inside of himself so that it would not hurt Estefania. That's all he remembered. And he had no memory of the convulsing, the lashing out, the police, any of that. Now, as the disturbances in the apartment intensified, people started hearing about it. During this period, a paranormal investigator named Tristan Bracher, I'm not sure, he became involved with the Gutiérrez family. He went to the apartment. In fact, he hadn't witnessed the Ouija board, the original Ouija board experiment, but he entered the case, when the activity was already going on. Bracher spent time with the family in the home at several occasions. He observed the disturbances, the supernatural, paranormal happenings. And he said he saw them throughout the house, the dark figures, objects moving, things like this, the sounds, the banging. He believed it was a genuine paranormal experience and that it was centered around Estefania. And I kind of want to say, duh, this seems to be pretty obvious. He said that Estefania had an entity attached to her, a dark spirit. He said it's not medical, it's not psychological. No, he wasn't a doctor or a psychiatrist. He was a paranormal investigator. But his conclusion was that there was a dark spirit attached to Estefania. Now, his involvement brought wider attention to the case, although some argued that he was kind of using the situation to build his own career, his reputation. There's always talk like that. Now, the saddest part of the case. In the summer of 1991, at age 18, Estefania had another, severe seizure. Like, she lost consciousness, and so they took her to the hospital. But at 2 a.m. the next morning, she died. She's only 18 years old, and she died. The cause of death was labeled as officially pulmonary asphyxia caused by convulsions. In other words, lack of oxygen because of convulsions. It was considered, though, marked unusual and unexplained because of her age. There was nothing wrong with her physically. Never had been diagnosed with epilepsy. And so when an 18-year-old girl dies, she's otherwise in good health, the doctors marked it as unusual and unexplained. So there was an official cause, lack of oxygen to the lungs. She is essentially suffocated because of the seizures, but it was still unusual. The doctors marked it as not normal somehow. Now, you might think this is the end of the story, but it's not. After Estefania's sad death and funeral and burial, now remember, she had requested that photograph of her and Maximo, her father, be placed in her coffin with her. And for some reason, they didn't do that. I don't think it was malicious. I think in the confusion and the grief, you don't remember every detail. And so the family was so focused on the horrible, sadness and tragedy of what had happened. They'd lost their daughter. They just didn't put the photograph in the coffin. But after her death, the paranormal activity increased. It intensified. The family heard knocking sounds, footsteps, and Estefania's own voice calling out throughout the house. Her bed, so every morning her bed, it would be made at night. They kept her room the same. In the morning, her bed would be, messed up as if someone had slept in it, though no one had been there, as if she herself had indeed come back from the dead and slept in her own bed in her own room. There were crucifixes on the walls around the house. As I said, Catholic family in a very Catholic country. But after Estefania's death, these crosses began to be seen upside down, inverted. In fact, the family witnessed once a cross slowly turning on the wall and turning upside down, right in front of their eyes. Then scratches appeared on the walls. The photograph I'm showing you now is a photograph of some of those scratches, the real photograph. And in addition to these horrible things, Concepcion, who's the mother, began feeling cold hands touching and grabbing her body when she was in bed at night and trying to sleep. Eerily, the family then not only would hear Estefania's voice around the house, but they started hearing the cruel, almost wicked laughter of Estefania's grandfather, the grandfather who had dementia and made that last-minute death or threat on his deathbed. They heard his laughter. They said it was clearly his voice. Maximo, the father, decided to install motion sensors around the house, thinking, okay, if we're hallucinating, if this is burglar, if this is just all coincidence, we'll find out. Or if it's a hoax, a prank, a culprit, this will determine it. He installed these motion sensors, and this was 1990, 91, so you didn't have, Ring cameras. It wasn't as easy to set up cameras around your house, but motion sensors were common enough. Throughout the night, the motion sensor alarms would go off repeatedly, but no one was there. They'd hear it, they'd run, no one was there, but they continued to go off repeatedly, as if those robed, dark, faceless figures, or maybe even Estefania or her grandfather themselves, were wandering around unseen in the night. The family was so scared that they basically put all their mattresses into one room and started staying there, sleeping there. They barricaded the door with furniture, and so they said, we're just going to sleep in this room together and not spread out. That way, no matter what happens, we'll be together, and there's strength in numbers. But one night, as they're there in the room, trying to go to bed, that furniture blocking the door basically scattered, and the door flew open by itself. So whatever was there was trying to let them know, you can hide, but I'll find you. Police were finally called to the apartment. The family called the police and wanted them to come investigate the occurrences. So some police officers, including the chief inspector, Jose Negri, they saw this unexplained phenomena. They witnessed doors opening, drawers opening by themselves. They heard those voices whispering. They heard the loud banging in the empty rooms. In fact, they did an experiment once, a few policemen. They gathered together in one room when the family was not there. The family was outside, and it was in the evening, and they decided to turn off the light and see what would happen, thinking that if this is a hoax or a prank, and we turn off the light and we hear something, we'll just turn it on immediately and run and catch the hoaxer. They turned off the light, and as soon as they did, immediately, they began hearing banging from different rooms all around the house. One of the officers got really scared and immediately flipped the light back on, and they could clearly see no one was in the house with them. What's interesting is that they filed an official police report about the events, and said in that report that yes, they believed that paranormal things were happening. Remember Tristan Breaker, the paranormal investigator I'd mentioned? He believed that this entity, he and the family believed that there was a main entity there, and they gave it a name. They named it Crapula. I don't know where that came from. It almost sounds like a really crappy Dracula, like Crapula. I'm sorry, I find that funny. I don't know where they came up with that name. I guess that Tristan said that was his name. I did some research. There's no known demon or entity named Crapula. I think the paranormal investigator just came up with that name. So they've got someone, they wrote it in the police report, this spirit called Crapula. I just find that really funny. And so the officers, as you can imagine, their colleagues, the other police, kind of made fun of them for this report, but they stood by their guns. They said, no, it really happened. We saw it. And after that chief of police, the chief inspector, Jose Negri, retired, he kind of was more open about it and said, yeah, he saw all these things. They could not be explained, he said, and the report is correct. Now, the disturbances continued for years. In 1993, on November 1st, which is All Saints' Day, which is kind of a day in the Catholic tradition and in other traditions around the world around that time, it's a day to remember the deceased, And so on that day, Concepcion, the mother, had a photograph of Estefania on a mantle. She walked into the room and saw it on the floor. She picked it up and said, it burned her hand. And so she dropped it. Then she picked it up again and saw that the image had been burned. Estefania's face had been burned through in the image. The glass was cracked but not broken, and the frame seemed to be okay. The image I'm showing you right here, the images, this is the real deal. This is the photograph as it appeared, with the burn mark on the face, as if something were trying to burn through the memory of Estefania, or maybe if she herself were trying to push her way into the world as she had said she would do. There was no evidence of fire anywhere. It was just the photograph itself that had burned. Different paranormal investigators investigated the apartment at different times, and some found nothing, but others experienced the phenomena. Audio recordings, EVP, mocked the investigators, told them to leave. I don't have all those EVP, electronic voice phenomena, but I do have one I'm going to play for you. This is the real thing, and it seems to be a spirit's voice, Estefania's voice, saying in Spanish, it's the grandfather, or beware of the grandfather. Take a listen. So that's the real EVP from the case. And that was recorded, by the way, I believe in the bathroom, which was the most active room of the house. Now in 1996, Estefania's body had to be exhumed. They said that, the family said it was exhumed due to cemetery arrangements. Now, I know in a lot of very crowded, populated cities, especially older cities like Madrid, the cemetery room is limited, and sometimes bodies have to be moved around. In fact, if you know the famous Paris catacombs, the reason all the bodies are down there is because of that. They ran out of room to bury bodies, and so they would rotate them, basically. You get to stay in the coffin a while, then you were moved. And so Estefania's body was exhumed. During this exhumation, remember that photograph of her and her father that she had wanted to be placed in the coffin? Well, they finally placed it in the coffin. Why they chose to do it then, I don't know. It was an opportunity. Maybe they remembered. But it was placed in the coffin. And this was in 1996. Now, after they did this, exhumed and then reburied her body in the new location where it had to move, and the photograph was placed there in the coffin, all the activity stopped. As if it really had been Estefania causing it, or inviting it in, or being associated with it somehow. And by finally granting her final request, they had maybe set her at peace. The family later would state that, they eventually moved out, and they said that despite the horror of the case, it brought them together closer as a family. The case basically still is kind of unresolved. It's, some people believe it was neurological illness. Others thought it might have been mold or radon in the apartment. Others think it's genuinely paranormal. You know which one I'm going to say. I think it was genuinely paranormal. It is one of the few cases like this with an official police report, and this photo here is the actual report. But assuming it is a paranormal case and not something else, which maybe it wasn't, but let's just say for the sake of argument that it was paranormal, I wonder what it was all about. The grandfather's dementia, did that affect his mind so much that even after death, he retained that strange, changed personality and anger? When the kids used the Ouija board, did they invite that grandfather spirit in, or did they invite in something far darker that pretended to be the grandfather? Why was it centered around Estefania, and why did she believe that she was going to die and then died? How did she know? What caused her convulsions? Was it really epilepsy? Well, she wasn't diagnosed with it. She didn't have it. Could it have been undiagnosed epilepsy? I suppose so. Everything's possible in cases like this. Had Estefania come back and harassed her family because they didn't put the photograph in the coffin? That seems so unlike her. She seemed like such a sweet girl, but keep in mind, after the initial Ouija board incident, her personality did change like that of her grandfather. The Spanish horror movie Veronica, like I said, was based on this case, and you should watch it if you haven't seen it. It's pretty good, pretty spooky scenes. It took some liberty, of course, because it's a movie, but it is directly based on this particular case. What do you think happened here? Was it real? Was it a hoax? Was it mental illness? And if it was real, how do you explain the grandfather, Estefanía, the spirits? What got into that house? Was it just one, or was it many, all the shadowy figures they saw walking around? Just remember, if you're going to try to open a portal to the spirit world, you should really know what you're doing. And if you're going to use a Ouija board, you should follow the instructions and always say goodbye before you end the session. This is Fangs and Folklore. Thanks for watching. As always, sleep well tonight, if you can.